You're listening to CoachingCues podcast, where experts all around the world answer your most burning questions surrounding the wide topic of strength training. Every week we tackle the what, the why, and the how of one specific topic in just 15 minutes. Straight to the point, no fluff. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this week's episode.
My name is Eric Trexler. I am the Director of Education at Stronger by Science. I'm a co-author of the Mass Research Review, and I'm a co-creator of the Macro Factor Diet app. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about dietary supplements. For this episode, I was asked to answer a very specific question, and the question was, what supplements does a lifter really need? And the direct answer to that is very simple and straightforward. In most cases, literally none. If you are healthy, you have no underlying medical conditions, and you have a well-balanced, well-rounded diet, you probably don't need any dietary supplements at all. But there are still reasons to consider supplementation. So dietary supplements can help us compensate for deficiencies in our diet. They can give us a little boost in some cases when it comes to performance or recovery. And they're also pretty convenient. So you might find that you tend to consume adequate protein more regularly when you use protein supplements rather than relying purely on food. So you certainly don't need any supplements in most cases, but there are very defensible reasons to consume them. I probably should disclose that I do advise some dietary supplement companies in exchange for compensation, but based on what I just said, you can probably infer I'm not trying to sell you on a long list of dietary supplements here. Before we get into the supplements that I do generally recommend for lifters, two really important things to highlight. First of all, your overall diet is far more important than any supplement you could introduce into it. Number two, there are very few supplements that are truly worth it when you consider their cost and the evidence that supports their use. So with that being said, let's dig in and talk about some supplements that make sense for lifters. When it comes to supplements and their effects on performance or body composition, I tend to separate them into separate tiers. So I want to begin by talking about the first tier supplements. And the first one is protein. So protein is an essential nutrient, but when it comes to the interests of the typical lifter, the main reason we want to focus on protein intake is because protein supports muscle building goals and also supports our muscles' ability to recover after hard training sessions. So both when it comes to body composition and performance, having inadequate protein in the diet would be a pretty bad plan. Usually, lifters will eat somewhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. And some people find it kind of challenging to consume that much protein from food sources. So using protein supplements is not better than consuming, a nice diverse mixture of reasonably high quality protein sources from food. However, it often tends to be a little bit more convenient. So that's why you'll find people supplementing with protein. The exact form doesn't really matter. You could talk about some very, very nuanced differences between certain forms of protein, but whether the source of your protein supplement is whey or casein or beef or egg or rice or pea or soy, there are a lot of really good protein powders and bars and other protein supplements on the market that simply serve to help you meet your dietary protein need for the day as a lifter. Aside from protein, the only other supplement that makes its way into the top tier for lifters is creatine. Creatine has a great reputation among lifters, and it's very well deserved. And it really all comes down to the role of creatine in the body. So our body stores creatine and phosphocreatine within our muscles, and we use this to fuel very high intensity exercise. So things that are very high in intensity but very short in duration. And this phosphocreatine energy system is emphasized very heavily during resistance training. The main issue is that we store this creatine and phosphocreatine in our muscles, but most of us are walking around naturally with a bit of a deficit. We haven't fully saturated our muscle creatine stores, and we do have the capacity to saturate our muscles even more with creatine and phosphocreatine to support these high intensity efforts. And there's a tremendous amount of research showing that if we do supplement with creatine, we can maximize our intramuscular storage of creatine, and this has really positive impacts on strength, power, and lean mass. There's also some evidence that creatine might have direct effects on hypertrophy as well, but either way, the longitudinal trials tell us that creatine has a really positive effect for individuals who are trying to get stronger, more powerful, or more muscular. A lot of companies claim that certain forms of creatine are more effective than others, but the reality is no form of creatine has more positive evidence than simple, basic creatine monohydrate. For most people, a daily dose of 3 to 5 grams per day of creatine monohydrate will be sufficient to maximize muscle creatine storage, and it usually takes about 3 to 4 weeks for that to happen. Some people don't want to wait 3 to 4 weeks, and that's okay. That's understandable. You can opt for a loading protocol. The most common is to take about 20 grams a day for 1 week, and that's usually split into 4 doses. So loading can often saturate your muscle creatine stores in only 1 week rather than waiting for 3 to 4. But you don't necessarily have to do loading. It's just a matter of how much of a rush you're in to fully saturate your muscle creatine stores. After that loading phase, then people typically drop down to a standard maintenance dose, which, like I said, is for most people somewhere in the 3 to 5 gram per day range. But people who are larger in body mass might consider a slightly higher dose than that. You may have heard that some people are non-responders to creatine, and that is true. Some people just walking around with their normal diet already have fully saturated or almost fully saturated muscle creatine stores. So when those individuals supplement with creatine, it doesn't have much of an effect, but it's because they're already enjoying the positive effects of having saturated creatine stores. That is thought to be approximately 20 to 30% of the population, but everybody else stands to benefit in some way from saturating their muscle creatine when it comes to strength and power performance. There are a number of unsubstantiated concerns related to creatine. For healthy individuals, there's no evidence to suggest that creatine will cause kidney or liver damage. There is no evidence to suggest that it facilitates or accelerates hair loss. There is no strong evidence linking it to dehydration or cramping. So there are a lot of these concerns that are commonly discussed, but the evidence would suggest that if you are an otherwise healthy individual using creatine as indicated with proper dosing, there don't seem to be any notable side effects. The main one that gets discussed is sometimes stomach discomfort if you're taking doses that are a little bit too large. Now we move on to the second tier supplements, and they're on the second tier either because they have smaller effects than protein and creatine, or because they have less evidence supporting them relative to protein and creatine. One of our second tier supplements is caffeine. Caffeine, when consumed at a dose of 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, about 30 to 60 minutes prior to an exercise bout, can increase performance. And it's been shown to enhance performance on endurance tasks, strength tasks, and power tasks. So caffeine has research supporting its use in a wide range of applications. Having said that, it's important to note that some people do have unfavorable responses to caffeine. They might feel very jittery, and people with certain cardiac medical conditions might not be able to consume high doses of caffeine. It's important to consider that caffeine consumed late in the day can have a negative impact on sleep quality. I generally don't recommend consuming high doses of caffeine after basically the early afternoon. There is some evidence that the size of effect we can expect when it comes to enhancing performance can shrink a little bit as we use caffeine more regularly. There's some degree of habituation, so the effect size actually starts to diminish over time. It doesn't disappear, but it does seem to get a little bit smaller based on the longitudinal trials we have access to. There's also the possibility that your genetics can impact your performance-related responses to caffeine. There are a few key genes that dictate the metabolism of caffeine and also the receptors that caffeine is interacting with. And based on your genetic inheritance, it might impact the way you respond to caffeine as a performance-enhancing supplement. Beta-alanine is another second-tier supplement. It works by increasing muscle saturation of carnosine, and this helps us as a buffer during intense exercise. So during exercise, the intramuscular environment becomes quite acidic, and as we increase muscle carnosine via beta-alanine supplementation, we can buffer that acidity and prolong intense exercise before fatigue occurs. And so this is particularly helpful for exercise that involves sprints that are 1 to 4 minutes in length, or repeated sprints that are shorter than that, or particularly high repetition resistance training or resistance training with particularly short rest periods. So if you do any kind of circuit training or metabolic conditioning or really high repetition lifting or lifting with very short rest periods or lifting that incorporates cardio between bouts of resistance training or between sets, beta-alanine might be helpful when it comes to your strength gains and increasing lean mass over time. On the other hand, if you lift like a typical power lifter and you have very few repetitions per set and you take long rest periods between sets, beta-alanine probably isn't going to help you very much. When it comes to dosing, people typically take around 4 to 7 grams per day of beta-alanine, and it's usually split into doses that are only 1 to 2 grams per dose. The reason they do this is to avoid paresthesia. This is an uncomfortable sensation. It kind of feels like tingly skin. It is harmless, but it tends to be unpleasant, so that's why you see people splitting their beta-alanine into 3, 4, sometimes even more than 5 doses per day. The final second-tier supplements for lifters are nitric oxide boosters, and there's 2 main nitric oxide boosters. One is citrulline, which is usually found in the form of citrulline malate. The other one is dietary nitrate, which is usually found in the form of some kind of beetroot extract or spinach extract. Citrulline and nitrate work via separate pathways, but they ultimately increase nitric oxide production. This can lead to vasodilation, increased blood flow during exercise, increased efficiency of exercise, and delayed muscle fatigue, in addition to increased muscle force. The most relevant application of these supplements for lifters pertains to strength endurance. So there's a decent amount of research indicating that with citrulline malate or with dietary nitrate, instead of reaching failure at 10 reps, maybe you'll reach failure at the 12th or 13th rep. It's about extending these higher repetition sets and delaying fatigue. There's also some literature suggesting that these supplements can specifically enhance force output during very high velocity muscle actions as well. When it comes to dosing, citrulline malate is usually provided in a ratio of 2 parts citrulline to 1 part malate. And usually people will consume 6 to 8 grams about an hour before a workout. If using L-citrulline alone without malate, then you'd be talking about somewhere around 3 to 6 grams. And again, that would be consumed 1 hour before workouts. When it comes to nitrate, a typical dose is 400 to 800 milligrams. And that's actually typically consumed 2 to 3 hours before the workout. It takes time for that nitrate to get converted to nitrite to then get converted to nitric oxide. And it's important to recognize that if you use a strong antibacterial mouthwash, you will not be able to convert nitrate to nitric oxide, and any nitrate-based supplement will not be effective. So that wraps up the second tier of supplements for lifters. There is a third tier, and the third tier is basically a huge list of supplements that we simply don't have enough evidence to reliably say how much they work, or supplements that only work in extremely specific contexts. So for most people that are interested in lifting, tier 1 and tier 2 are going to be the supplements that make sense. There are some very select instances where some of these tier 3 supplements might make sense, or possibilities possibilities where some of these tier 3 supplements might move up into the second tier as they acquire more evidence. But for now, the typical lifter will want to spend most of their focus on the supplements that fall in tier 1 and tier 2. Lifters may also have an interest in using multivitamin supplements or fish oil supplements, and those are generally advisable in certain scenarios, but since they are more related to general health and wellness rather than performance or body composition, I won't be able to cover them in this podcast episode. Finally, 2 important recommendations. First of all, I would always consult with a qualified medical professional before I made any changes related to my diet or supplement habits. Number 2, whenever possible, I would try to find supplements that have had their quality independently verified via third-party testing. Thank you for joining me for this quick rundown of supplements for lifters. If you'd like to get in touch with me or ask any questions, you can find me on Instagram at Trexler Fitness, or you can head over to strongerbyscience.com. And if you go there, you're going to find information about the Mass Research Review, the Macro Factor Diet app. You're also going to find an archive with a ton of podcast episodes and articles related to supplementation for lifters.
Thank you for listening to CoachingCues podcast. If you would like your question to be answered by an expert, please head to coachingcues.org/ask. See you next week.